This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
It is repeated endlessly. The U.S. government says it is defending a rules-based international order, but who gets to write the rules?
Americans have even gone further than just ignoring the United Nations Charter. They now claim this phrase, this rules-based order. What do you mean, rules-based order? What rules?
The U.S. puts its domestic laws first while ignoring international laws and has been using long-arm jurisdiction as a tool to crack down on foreign entities.
长臂管辖呢，是美国依据美国的国内法对外国的实体和个人进行肆意打压的单边制裁工具。
More and more countries are standing up to American hegemony, and the U.S.'s ability has been gradually falling short of its ambition.
Europe needs to react, China needs to react, otherwise we are going to live in a world where the United States use laws as weapons to continue to weaken competitors.
Join us this week with BizTalk and find out about the hypocrisy of so-called rules-based international order and how the U.S. is bending the rule of law to its whim. Only on BizTalk, only on CGTN. Hello and welcome to this special edition of BizTalk. I'm Guan in Beijing. The U.S. has been advocating the so-called rules-based international order, but it has constantly put its domestic law above international law and has been using long-arm jurisdiction to crack down on foreign entities. Is it what Washington calls rules-based international order or rules perpetuated by the U.S. for its own interests? To learn more about this, today we're joined by two distinguished guests. Professor Alessandro Teixeira from Tsinghua University is a former Minister of Tourism and Minister of Development, Industry and Foreign Trade of Brazil. Welcome to the show, Professor Teixeira.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Professor Kong Qinjiang, Dean of the School of International Law at China University of Political Science and Law. Thank you for joining us, Professor Kong. The United States puts its domestic law above international laws and uses long-arm jurisdiction as a tool to advance its own agenda. The U.S. has enacted such restrictive laws as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, and the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. It has also issued a series of executive orders targeting specific countries, entities, or individuals. The ambiguous rules are a willful expansion of the jurisdiction of U.S. domestic laws. The U.S. also abuses its domestic channels of prosecution to exercise long-arm jurisdiction over entities and individuals in other countries. Professor Teixeira, let me start with you. What exactly is so-called rules-based international order championed by the U.S.? What's your views and comments on the fact that the U.S. itself often ignore, evade, or even rewrite the rules whenever they seem inconvenient?
They always say that if you have an American company, an American person involved in any kind of situation, they can use the internal law to analyze the situation. A good example is what they call, it's a bias, because what they call corruption. The United States inside the country use that as a lobby. But when the countries, they try to lobby in industry, they say that it's corruption. So they apply a corruption act that is inside the United States, is not a value in other countries. That's a curious, I would say, measure that the United States has been taking to fight competition elsewhere.
Right.
So every time they found that a company is trying to use the same things that they use inside the American market that's called lobby, that is a legal procedure in the United States, they say, oh, goes against my corruption act. So it's a very double standard situation.
As of fiscal year 2021, the entities and individuals on U.S. sanction lists topped 9,421, which was 933% higher compared to the fiscal year 2000. The U.S.'s unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction have gravely undermined the sovereignty and security of other countries and severely impacted their economic development and people's well-being. Professor Guan, does long-arm jurisdiction has legal basis in international affairs?
Long-arm jurisdictions actually are referred to such a situation where a domestic law of a given country is given extraterritorial effect, that is, legal effect beyond its borders. And international laws, to some extent, recognize a country in certain conditions may implement so-called long-arm jurisdiction. However, customary international law has imposes a lot of disciplines upon the implementations of such long-arm jurisdiction. First of all, it has to meet a condition that such an act concern will be connected with the country that intends to impose so-called long-arm jurisdiction. Secondly, if such an act has caused injury to a third country, to a third nation, then the third nation will be in the position to retaliate in the form of countermeasures. And actually, there's another thing, that is the international so-called long-arm jurisdiction cannot be exercised at the cost of other countries' jurisdiction. Judged from this perspective, we will find the U.S. actually is often abusing so-called long-arm jurisdiction, and that are subject to legal challenge on international law.
And Professor Guan, do you agree that the United States is using sanction as a tool to stifle competition?
At least the three factors are connected with the drastic increase of the U.S. sanction. First, the U.S. used weaponizing sanction to punish its rivalries. In a way, the country has relied on sanctions to pursue its diplomatic, economic, political interest and strategic interest. For example, in order to contain Russia and China strategically, the U.S. has not only sharpened its tools, but implemented more sanctions from its legal toolkits. Secondly, the U.S. is competing with its rivalries, so it needs to mobilize its allies. Employing the sanction tools against its rivalries will cause tensions and will also have the effect of creating an atmosphere in which its allies might follow up. Thirdly, the U.S. economy does not go well, particularly as inflation surges. It needs to divert the public attention to its achievements, so-called achievements on international stage. Resorting to sanctions against its rivalries has such a psychological effect.
Coming up next, the U.S. is abusing its dominance in economic and judicial matters to weaken other companies around the world. Why do you think the United States was after Alstom and Huawei?
Technology, the long-arm justice, twisted some internal law to avoid competition.
The U.S. used weaponizing sanctions to punish its rivalries.
.360-degree profiles of industry movers and shakers, tech mavericks, and policymakers. We drill down on their success. We ask how they set strategy and how they navigate in an increasingly competitive market. Real talk, real business. Join the conversation. BizTalk, only on CGTN.
Long-arm jurisdiction is controversial due to the lack of clear definitions under international law. It is believed that America has taken long-arm jurisdiction upon itself to become the world's judge and jury. When it comes to improper extraterritorial application of American laws, long-arm jurisdiction rarely go to trial, and firms involved are limited in what they can say to defend themselves. In 2013, French industrial conglomerate Alstom executive Frédéric Pierucci was arrested in New York. Alstom stood as a symbol of France's industrial power but was then dismembered by the United States. Let's take a look how the U.S. is using long-arm jurisdiction to trap its prey.
Well, the American trap is basically the way the US is using the law as an economic weapon to weaken their competitors.
In April 2013, Frederick Pierucci found himself at the heart of a state scandal when he was arrested after he landed at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York.
Alstom, basically, if you know the company, basically is involved in power generation. So Alstom has built all the nuclear steam turbine for the French nuclear power plants.
Pierucci was then senior executive of Alstom's boiler subsidiary. He was accused of bribery after the French company won a power plant contract in Indonesia.
He told me that if you plead guilty, you're going to be released in 6 months.
Pierucci refused. The U.S. imprisoned him for more than 2 years. He later found out that his arrest was part of a secret economic war that the United States was waging against some European countries.
On the Alstom side, the clear goal was to buy out the company and to control basically all the nuclear power plant in France.
In the end, Alstom was forced to pay a $772 million fine. That was the biggest financial penalty ever imposed by the United States. The company also gave up control of its power branch to General Electric, its biggest competitor in America.
Before Alstom, you had several companies who went through this. You had Total, Technip, Alcatel, but every time the company managed to make a deal with the United States and sign a plea agreement and pay a big check. That did not make the headline. What was different about Alstom is that basically Alstom did not only pay a check, but then was basically sold out to General Electric.
The United States has been using long-arm jurisdiction against the foreign entities, with Huawei and Alstom being some of the high-profile victims. Professor Teixeira, why do you think the United States was after Alstom and Huawei?
Technology, basically. That's the main target of them. They want to contain leadership of Huawei, for example, and Alstom, because they see that they are getting that we are talking about 5G, we are talking about new technology. So if they cannot contain them at the, let's say, do a proxy here, if you cannot contain at the pitch with their players, what they do, they ask the referee to intervene. Okay, and that's exactly what's happened in this case. Those companies, they are winning the economic match. Okay, so they cannot stop them at economic level. So what they do, they go to the referee, they go to the legal part or their jurisdictions to say, okay, you are doing something bad. They are not doing anything bad. There is no problem with data. There is no problem with big data. It's just a question of leading technology. So they are abusing, they are using their legal law system to try, as it says, a long-arm justice, to try to input some problems with those companies, so our viewers can understand. So they use their internal jurisdiction and twisted some internal law to avoid competition. This is a no-competitive act, and they are always very vocal that the world needs to be a free world, free competitive, free markets. And when they are losing the game that they set up the rules, they want to change it.
5 years after the Alstom crackdown, the United States used a similar strategy against Huawei as part of Washington's sanctions against the Chinese telecom giant.
我终于回家了。
It is a long way back home for Meng Wanzhou, chief financial officer of Chinese telecom giant Huawei. On December 1st, 2018, Sabrina Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Canada at the request of New York court. Meng was charged in connection with Huawei's alleged violations of U.S. sanctions on Iran. Meng was freed on bail days later and lived in Vancouver while fighting extradition to the United States. After nearly 3 years on the house arrest in Canada, Meng Wanzhou was released in September 2021.
Over the past 3 years,
my life has been turned upside down. It was a disruptive time for me as a mother, a wife, and a company executive. But I believe every cloud has a silver lining.
Meng's arrest via the use of said long-arm jurisdiction sparked widespread controversy.
There is a very similarity in the way that the U.S. Department of Justice is approaching this. Basically, in order to put pressure on the company, they arrest or they indict somebody close to the top of the company. So what is happening to Mrs. Meng is very similar to what happened to me. Now, on the Huawei side, it's more to stop a competitor who has a big advantage in a unique technology, which is the 5G technology, which is the technology of the future.
And Professor Guan, is long-arm jurisdiction practiced by the U.S. fair for these targeted companies?
I don't think the U.S. achieved its goal when it imposes a sanction on these targeted companies. Of course, the purpose of the sanction is to undermine the position of such companies as Huawei in the global market and its competitiveness of the technology. However, such a sanction cannot be contributed to its final goal. And Huawei, as far as I know, Huawei actually has become a leader in the 5G technology development and has done quite well so far. Yeah.
The U.S. has never hesitated to initiate aggressive sanctions against companies and entities around the world to maintain its hegemony. Toshiba, Japan's leading semiconductor chip producer in the 1980s, was sanctioned by the United States over national security concerns and banned from the U.S. market for years. Even U.S. allies and partners want to keep all options open when it comes to relations with the country. In August 2018, French President Macron called on Europe to defend its strategic interests and financial independence with tools that can fend off U.S. extraterritorial sanctions. He criticized the U.S. by saying, "The partner with whom Europe built the post-World War order appears to be turning its back on this shared history." Why are economic sanctions increasingly being used by America, Professor Teixeira?
Basically, when we analyze international trade, they use that to use as a measure of protection of their market. They like to say that they like competition, but when they are, I would say, they are threats in a good way, because this is not a war threat, it's a commercial threat with someone that is more competitive than them, they try to raise sanctions. They try to create walls. So in fact, in one side, they advocate free trade, they advocate free measures, but when you're going to see, they create sanctions to stop companies, to stop sectors around the world, and that's just not happened with China, happened with other countries. So that's a no competitive action. That's what I call it. If you want to be a free world, there is no reason why you want to have sanctions. And that's what they are doing now with Russia. That's what they have been doing with China for quite a long time to protect themselves because they are not real competitive in some sectors. We see that with semiconductors. We are seeing that with Chip 4, the alliance that the United States proposed with South Korea, with Japan towards the semiconductors and chip industry to avoid competition.
So what can be done to counter these long-arm jurisdictions, Professor Teixeira?
The first thing is denounce, okay? That's the most important thing, denounce and talk in the international level. Second, if it's hurting and we can prove that it's hurting a company, and that was the case that Huawei was discussion, go to international courts and go to institutions like WTO and United Nations to show what's going on. And third, as Professor Kong says, we have internal mechanisms, even the internal legal system of the country that has been affected to challenge those measures.
Coming up next, upholding the international order set by the UN Charter.
What worries me most, however, is the fact that the rules-based international order is being challenged. Quite surprisingly, not by the usual suspects, but by its main architect and guarantor, the US.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
The US has mostly given up on key international institutions it had previously helped to build. That most notably includes the United Nations and World Trade Organization, except when those bodies serve a convenient purpose.
美国在指责别人之前，应当先反躬自省。为什么美国要退出世卫组织？为什么美国要退出巴黎协定和伊朗核问题全面协议？谁是国际规则的破坏者？谁对国际秩序构成威胁？国际社会对此看得清清楚楚。
The US has withdrawn from 17 international organizations and treaties since the 1980s, including the United Nations Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, the Paris Agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran Nuclear Program, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Treaty on Open Skies. And Professor Teixeira, should rules be designed by a few countries by the US? Who gets to write the rules?
Since the beginning of United Nations, if we go a little bit before United Nations, called the League of Nations, in 1920 after the First World War, and then later United Nations, one of the clear rules in terms of United Nations decisions and around United Nations is that we need to agree upon the rules. If there is many countries that disagree, will not be incorporated by United Nations. So basically what United States does is they overuse the term of, I would say, international rule and use their own vision to impose or to dictate different ways to behave other countries. That's absurd, in my opinion. That happens a lot, not just with China, but happens with Latin American countries a lot when they have a vision, what they call democracy, when they have a vision, what they call international trade, and they want the other countries to abide for their law. In my opinion, that's wrong, and we should acknowledge any international rules that is not a law, is rules, is a guideline. We need to look at the United Nations Charter. That's it.
Beijing's actions continue to undermine the rules-based order.
We will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China.
The false U.S. accusations fail against China, but its sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction constitutes a gross violation of international law and basic norms of international relations. A 2015 estimate says that a third of the world's people live under some form of economic sanctions, some massively lethal. U.S. bullying has been widely rejected by the international community. Tufts professor Daniel Dressner is also a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, and he says sanctions not only are ineffective but also exert a humanitarian toll. Dressner says that the United States of America has become the United States of sanctions. A French daily newspaper points out that long-arm jurisdiction has been used by the United States to weaken foreign competitors. Professor Cohn, some U.S. officials claim that China is a challenger or threat to current world order.
For me, it should be pointed out at the very beginning, there is no such an exact term as rules-based international order in international law. On the surface, the term invented by the U.S. is neutral. As a matter of fact, it's meant to confer moral superiority on whoever invents it and whoever is using it. For example, when the US uses the term to blame China or other country for its international behavior, it's suggesting that the blamed country is not abiding by the rules. For me, it should be reminded that whether the rule-based international order depends on what rules the user is referring to. If the rules refer to those embedded in the UN Charter, the term is welcoming. The problem is that the US often imparts its own understanding to the international rule. Sometimes the US even refers to its own rules or the rules made by itself and its alliance. That's why many countries do not agree with this term. One country will be in the position to impose unilaterally its own rules upon other countries. For China, I think international order, there is only one international order which should be centered around the United Nations. And there's only one international law that is based on the UN Charter and the well-recognized principles of international law.
Why is the U.S. capable of long-arm jurisdiction? The U.S. has abused its financial hegemony and technological clout and engaged in economic coercion, but the U.S. is seeing diminishing returns on financial sanctions. The more the United States threatens companies with the loss of access to its financial sectors or penalizes those relying on dollars for various sanctions, the more attractive alternative structural arrangements may become. We're seeing that more and more countries started to reduce their reliance on the U.S. dollar, on the financial system, and technology cooperation. Will U.S. bullying behaviors backfire, Professor Teixeira?
I think it's already backfiring. The case that I would like to give, for example, is the Summit of the Americas, where the United States organized the meeting in Los Angeles and didn't invite some countries of Latin America because they didn't like it. They didn't invite Venezuela, they did not invite Nicaragua, they did not invite Cuba. That's a bullying process. If you want to discuss democracy, you need, one of the characteristics that you need to be able to sit and discuss with people that doesn't agree with you. And that's not what the United States has done. So countries like Mexico, like Argentina, in some extent, the president of Mexico didn't go to the meeting because he said, no, that's not the way I want. He stopped it. So our position in Latin America, in the majority of Latin America, is to say, okay, stop talking, stop telling me what to do. Act accordingly what you say you want to do. So this is kind of saying, okay, we are tired of you bullying or you telling, or you taking the leadership that nobody asked you to take it. Okay, so that's, I think it's already clear in the international scenario, in my opinion.
So the rules-based international order championed by the United States is in fact another version of power politics. By using long-arm jurisdiction and other measures, the United States imposes its own will and standards on others. In a world that has already been threatened by geopolitical tensions, recession risks, and climate catastrophes, a further split of commonly accepted international laws and norms will lead to unforeseeable danger. And that's all for this edition of BizTalk. Thank you for being with us. Until next time, bye for now.